Right, so politically there's a lot of instability that's going on here in the latter part of the Middle Ages. Culturally, there are some things going on as well within Christianity regarding, the role of the papacy. Should the Pope, right, papacy refers to the office of the Pope, should the Pope have the ability to tell all Christians, and we're talking here in the West, what to do, how to understand Christianity, how to interpret the Bible, and should the Pope also have political power over the governance of these developing nations? In the latter part of the Middle Ages, there are kind of two nations that really have some major issues with the papacy. The first is England. Since the 1000s, there had been tension between England and the Pope. And a lot of that tension was over the English leaders swearing to the Pope to follow his lead, swearing fealty to him. Some of the bishops, right, so Catholicism has a hierarchy. At the top sits the Pope. Then there are these regional leaders known as bishops, and then below them are priests. And so priests are the religious leaders in the local churches. Well, the Pope believed it was his right, his authority, to appoint bishops in every nation. Right? So he could say who was bishop in England, who was bishop in France, who was bishop in Spain. The English kings start to say, we should probably have that authority. Right? And so there's this tension over who has the right to establish religious leaders in a local situation. And often, bishops appointed by the Pope found themselves in conflict with the kings because of their fealty to the bishop. In England, there's a variety of ways where this tension grows over the years. Somewhat different is what occurs in France. The early French monarchs, as the kingship develops in France, a lot of those early French kings are very weak politically. And so they need the Pope's authority to kind of stabilize their government. But as they start to develop, through the latter part of the Middle Ages, the French kings begin to gain more and more power. And the papacy decides to really connect themselves to the French government. And the French government was given a lot of rights over the Catholic Church in France that other places weren't. Eventually, though, one of the popes decides that France has too much power. And so Boniface VIII tries to make more and more control of political power. So the King of France at the time, a man named Philip the Fair, Philip IV, decides we don't need as much of papal power and authority in France. And so he begins to support Boniface's enemies. He takes lands from the church. He throws a bishop in prison. And so the Pope, out of all of this, releases a document called Unum Sanctum. The translation is One Holy Church, is what the translation is. And essentially, Boniface in Unum Sanctum claims this kind of universal authority. So, for example, he says, there is only one Catholic Church, and outside this church, there is no salvation or remission of sins. And so kind of, you got to be in the church to be saved. Now, behind this is a religious power known as excommunication. Excommunication was essentially somebody being expelled or kicked out of the Catholic Church. Right? If you did something that was morally inappropriate, or if you found yourself afoul of the Pope. right? Politically, some sort of economic issue. And so what he's saying is, there's this threat. If you don't fall in line, you will be expelled. And if you're expelled from the church, you have no hope in the hereafter. And so he also says in Unum Sanctum, there we declare, state, define, and pronounce, you got to say it 4 or 5 times, that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff, which is another term that means the Pope. Right? Everybody has to be subject to the Pope. And so Boniface decides, I'm excommunicating Philip. Well, Philip decides, I'm kidnapping Boniface. And so Boniface is kidnapped. He is paraded through Paris, humiliated, and dies shortly afterward. Now, after his death, there was a couple minor successes, but eventually the French arranged for the election of a new pope named Clement V. And he establishes the papacy in the city of Avignon, France. So the papacy had lived in Rome for 1,000+ years. It is now set up in France. And for 70 years, this is sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the church by some Catholics, right? That 70 years the Jews are in Babylon, the comparison is made to this. For the next 70 years, various popes have tried to release themselves from French control and move back to Rome, often very unsuccessful. During this time, there was the increase of power in some ways of the papacy. Money went to the papacy, taxes, other types of things went to the church in Avignon. But it also decreased the power. In the latter part of the 1300s, the Pope named Gregory XI died. At the time, most of the cardinals, the people that selected the new Pope, were French. And so Gregory XI had moved back to Rome. But the French decided they're going to create a new Pope. And so eventually there are 2 popes. There's a Pope in Rome and a Pope in France. And everybody's confused. Who's the true Pope? Right? Because the Pope in Rome says, well, right, I'm the successor, I was chosen. But the cardinals, the French cardinals, say, no, this is the true Pope. These popes aren't content to let the other person be Pope. And so there are military battles between the two, trying to unseat the other. The Pope in Rome dies, there's another election. The Pope in Avignon dies, there's another election. Eventually, King Charles of France, at one point, at the death of a Pope, the French Pope, says, please, don't elect another Pope. And so they promptly elected another Pope. All right? And so there's this continuing two popes. And eventually, it gets to the point where there are 3 popes. Because what eventually is determined is the cardinals say, all right, we have these 2 popes. Let's call a council, right? And so conciliar has to do with councils. We'll call a council, we'll bring all these bishops together, and we'll say, let's figure out how to get out of this mess. So the council says, all right, there are a couple things we could do here. We could convince one of the 2 popes to resign, and then the other pope will be pope. We can say neither of them are pope, and we'll elect a new pope. And so, there are a couple things that we can do here. And so they eventually decide, these 2 guys we got in there, they're not going to step down. So these guys are no longer pope. We'll elect a new guy. Well, the 2 popes, the one in Avignon and one in France, they still think they're pope. And so there are 3 popes, one elected by the cardinals, one elected in Rome, one elected in admiral. Eventually, some deaths happen, some people are in prison, then eventually it gets back to one pope. But for this 80 plus years, there's so much confusion in Europe over who's the leader of the church. And so all sorts of things are going on, and eventually it's decided we can't hold on to this one leader. We need a council of people, a council of religious leaders to make decisions. And that lasts about like that. Right? It stays around for a couple of years, but eventually later popes are able to get rid of the idea that every so often councils are going to meet and make decisions. But still there's this push for it. There's got to be reform. There's got to be change. We have all this instability. That's a very brief overview because there's a lot more to it than that. But, you see this kind of developing changes of, there's so much going on. Also, in the time period we're talking about is the development of the Renaissance. Renaissance was a revival of interest in classical philosophy, in Roman law. Starts off in Italy, but eventually spreads elsewhere. And during this time, we have the development of what becomes known as the humanities, this interest in human beings and in behavior. And all sorts of different things begin to occur out of that. I want to mention a couple of individuals who become prominent in the Renaissance because of some of the things that it will lead to for the Reformation. So there's an individual named Petrarch. Why is he important? Well, one of the things that becomes important out of Petrarch is his interest in old manuscripts. Manuscripts of Greek and Roman philosophers, legislators. And so he begins to collect them from where they reside most of the times are in these monasteries where monks are living. Other places, sometimes in churches as well. And so he begins collecting these, copying these, and so people become interested in these old manuscripts. And those old languages like Latin and Greek. Then of course there is Dante Alighieri, from the city of Florence in Italy, but influenced by some things that are going on in France. Studied philosophy and theology, but he's most known for his literary works, particularly a work known as the Divine Comedy. It's called a comedy because of its happy ending. But it starts off with a trip through hell. Probably not fun times. It's written in the common language instead of Latin. And so there's this transition to adopting other languages other than Latin. So overall, the poem is Dante's journey through hell, through purgatory and heaven. And as he tells it, it begins on Good Friday in the year 1300. He is guided on this trip by the Roman poet Virgil. And so his guide through heaven, through hell, purgatory, and heaven is a Roman, right? A pagan. And so there's this interest in Roman things. Dante loves Virgil's Aeneid, which was Aeneas' journey to the underworld. And so there's kind of a play on that. Eventually he is guided by his love Beatrice, who had been married to someone else and died, and Bernard of Clairvaux as well. He encounters and sees a variety of historical and mythological figures from Greek and Roman history and myths. He also encounters a variety of older popes, and he also kind of indicates that the popes that were in charge at his time, there's two popes at the time, both of those are destined for hell. And so, a very negative approach to the church as well. Another prominent figure during the time, of course we could say more about the Divine Comedy, is a man named Lorenzo Valla. Not only did the Renaissance bring an interest in classical literature, it also brought an interest in a critical approach to literature. And so as people became interested in classical texts, they began to be interested in trying to find the most correct version of those texts, to try and figure out what was copyist errors, and if there was only a partial manuscript, what was the rest of it. And so a lot of comparing manuscripts that were discovered, right, was often referred to as textual criticism. Valla is important because of his textual critical methods used to examine a document known as the Donation of Constantine. The Donation of Constantine was a work that purported to be the Emperor Constantine, who lived during the 4th century, so the 300s, giving certain lands and powers to the Pope, to the Bishop of Rome. And so this document had been used for hundreds of years to demonstrate why the Pope should have political power. Valla, because of his scholarly investigation of the text, showed that the language used was a forgery. It was later language. It couldn't have been used in the 4th century. And so he's able to demonstrate that this key document that had supported papal power was false. So, that's now another challenge. Now, Valla's work, the Divine Comedy as well, often didn't make a great impact until later generations. There's low levels of literacy among people in Europe. A lot of these types of works are reserved for the intellectual class. There's low circulation because it takes forever to copy it out. And Valla died before a major invention that we'll talk about here in a minute. In England, you have the work of Geoffrey Chaucer. Little's known of Chaucer's life. One of the things we know about Chaucer, of course, comes from one of his major works, the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer was a high-placed civil servant in England, right, so he had some governmental official. The Canterbury Tales, of course, have religious components to it. He starts off by saying, "Now I beg all those that listen to this little treatise," referring to the Canterbury Tales, "or read it, that if there be anything in it that pleases them, they thank our Lord Jesus Christ for it, from whom proceeds all understanding and goodness." Right? So it has, this kind of starts off with this kind of religious statement. Chaucer dies before Canterbury Tales is complete. The plan was to tell a story of 30 pilgrims going from the city of London to the shrine of a very prominent English Christian named Thomas of Becket, who had been murdered in his cathedral. And so on the way, these pilgrims tell stories to each other about who they are and some other things. And so the plan was each of the people would tell 2 stories there, 2 stories back. He doesn't finish before his death. A lot of it, of course, reflects Chaucer's time, the literary form of the time, and the Renaissance. But it also reflects a lot of religious themes. Many of the characters are religious. There's a monk, there's a priest, there's a prioress, who would have been a woman in charge of a convent where nuns gathered. There was a pardoner, a summoner, a friar. Some of these people are presented in a very positive light. Others are not. The pardoner. The pardoner was essentially someone who was responsible for dealing with people. Sorry, I forgot to turn the mic back on. One of the things that's presented in Canterbury Tales is this growing distrust, this growing belief in the corruption of the church. And so, this becomes a very important theme throughout several of the people of the Renaissance. Also very important from the Renaissance is the Gutenberg press. In the early years of the development of the press, there's not much of an impact. The press was used in ways that didn't make the documents easy to read, but of course it does become very important. Gutenberg developed the movable type printing press in 1439 and printed the first dated book in 1457. It actually was a copy of the Psalms. The press became very important for disseminating works to a larger audience. It also was used to copy classical literature, other works. But here again, a lot of it is for a specific elite class. It doesn't become usable for the masses or used for the masses until the Reformation, when people in the Reformation decide we need to get this information out to the common people. Papermaking also very important in the development of this, right? So this spread of written learning. Papermaking had actually been gained by the way of Muslims, and the Muslims had gotten it from the Chinese. So it's that's kind of where papermaking comes from.